The helicopters circled above the snow-capped Rockies. Motorcades rolled in under the veil of silence. Protesters were pushed 50 miles away from the summit site. Kananaskis, Alberta had become the most locked-down zone in North America. And before Air Force One even touched down, the most dramatic moment had already occurred. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney scrapped the G7 communique. No warning, no consultation, no photo-op handshake. Just a blank slate where global consensus used to live. For the first time since the summit's founding in 1975, the host nation refused to issue a final joint statement. It was a diplomatic shockwave, and a signal to the world, this isn't diplomacy anymore. It's damage control. When Trump finally arrived, the chaos was already quietly underway. He came armed with a list of demands. 5% of GDP on military budgets from all members, fresh tariffs across major sectors, and a chilling suggestion during his flight to reconsider Canada's long-term integration with the United States. It was more than rhetoric. Only weeks before, Trump had floated the idea that Canada should have been part of the US from the start, language that sparked fury in Ottawa and condemnation from retired Canadian defense chiefs. Now, under the banner of economic sovereignty, Washington's trade war has mutated into something bigger, territorial posturing. France's Emmanuel Macron made sure he wasn't cornered. In a diplomatic masterstroke, he made an unannounced detour to Greenland, landing just hours before arriving in Alberta. There, standing alongside Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, Macron declared that Greenland was not a bargaining chip. The message was directed squarely at Trump, who had once again floated the idea of purchasing the autonomous Danish territory during a May 2025 interview on Fox News. Macron used symbolism, media, and timing to hijack the summit's narrative before Trump could even open his mouth. His team flooded European channels with images of solidarity, sovereignty, and defiance. Diplomacy was no longer being negotiated, it was being staged. Meanwhile, Carney's decision to cancel the communique was both calculated and devastating. Traditionally, the G7's closing statement serves as a symbol of unity, one that lays out common goals on trade, security, and climate. Scrapping it stripped the summit of its legitimacy. Carney's aides told Bloomberg the move was deliberate. Canada refused to lend credibility to Trump's trade agenda, especially after the White House imposed a 10% universal tariff on all imports, including those from traditional allies. That decision alone affected over $1 trillion in goods. Trump had hoped to use the G7 to validate his hardline stance. Instead, he left with nothing but silence and empty backdrops. According to Reuters, European and American delegations were completely blindsided by Carney's maneuver. Macron's team called it unprecedented. A German delegate told reporters it wasn't chaos, it was strategic silence. Behind that silence was the loudest statement possible: Canada no longer trusts the process. And it's not hard to see why. Trump has targeted Canadian sectors with surgical precision: 22% tariffs on dairy, 10% on aluminum, 14% on lumber. The results have been brutal. Statistics Canada estimates the country lost $4.2 billion in the first quarter of 2025 alone, largely from export penalties in those industries. But Carney's move wasn't just about rejecting Trump. It was about reclaiming control. At this summit, every country came not to build unity, but to prevent disaster. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba arrived with legal documents ready for emergency WTO mediation. Tokyo's $74.1 billion trade surplus with the US has made it a target for Section 232 steel tariffs. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz is facing enormous pressure at home after Berlin's exports to the US dropped by €17.5 billion following Trump's tariff increases, with automakers among the hardest hit. The UK's Keir Starmer managed to secure a digital trade exemption, but it only lasts 12 months and explicitly excludes financial services. Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum prepared a legal firewall in anticipation of a US threat to double cross-border tariffs if Mexico doesn't adopt an American-style asylum framework. Even India's Narendra Modi, invited as a guest, came under diplomatic scrutiny. Canadian police are currently investigating a plot linked to Indian government operatives targeting Sikh activists in Toronto. It wasn't a summit anymore. It was a triage unit. Everyone was bleeding economically. And nobody trusted the man leading the G7's largest economy. The World Bank's June 2025 global report confirmed the stakes. They downgraded global GDP growth by 0.7%, attributing much of that contraction to US trade unpredictability and the rising tide of retaliatory tariffs. Since Trump's second term began, the United States has imposed levies on over $1.3 trillion in imports and revoked 6 bilateral exemptions, all within 90 days of renegotiation. Capital inflows to developing countries dropped by 12.4% in the first quarter alone. Markets are spooked. Investments are drying up. And Washington isn't offering reassurance, it's offering more volatility. And through it all, Carney remained calm. No final press conference. No handshake line. No moment for Trump to claim unity. Just a sterile chair summary released quietly, outlining only what had been discussed, not what had been agreed. Max Bergman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies told Bloomberg, Carney didn't just mute the microphone, he controlled the lighting, the framing, and the final shot. This wasn't retreat. It was a message. And everyone got it. On the surface, the summit looked like it was functioning, leaders arriving, meetings taking place. But underneath, alliances were eroding. The EU has quietly implemented tariff defense mechanisms that automatically trigger retaliatory levies if Trump escalates. As soon as the White House floated a potential 17% tariff on European machinery, that mechanism kicked in. Japan's delegation requested WTO arbitration on aluminum classification. Mexico came ready for battle. And every bilateral interaction at the summit felt more like pre-litigation than diplomacy. One senior Canadian official told reporters, this wasn't a summit. It was a containment field. And maybe they are right. The G7, once the engine of global economic coordination, now looks more like a fractured diplomatic photo op. The founding purpose was clear: coordinate policies, defend shared values, promote stable recovery. What we have now is a forum where every nation hedges, stalls, and distances itself from the American agenda. Trump's calls for 5% military budgets were met with a resounding no. Carney himself said Canada would not use its national budget as a metric for NATO compliance. Macron laughed off the idea in private meetings. Even Britain, traditionally Washington's closest ally, refused to endorse a defense increase without parliamentary review. So where do we go from here? If this was the G7's dress rehearsal for collapse, what happens at NATO, where real military budgets are on the table and security commitments have consequences? If Trump brings the same tactics to Brussels, demanding budgets, issuing threats, pushing sovereignty narratives, does NATO hold? Or does it fracture the way this summit already has? Carney's refusal to issue a joint G7 statement marks the second time in 7 years that a Canadian Prime Minister has refused to endorse unity under Trump. But this time, it wasn't symbolic. It was structural. According to AFP, multiple G7 diplomats now privately refer to the summit as a legacy construct, a diplomatic relic useful for optics, but hollow when it comes to real policy alignment. One delegate reportedly asked during a private dinner, if the host won't sign it, and the guest ignores it, what exactly are we defending? That question lingers. What began as a forum for collaboration is now a battleground of containment. Carney may not have issued a statement, but his silence shouted something louder than any communique. And Trump, deprived of his stage, left Canada empty-handed. No paper to wave. No unity to declare. Just a world more uncertain than when he arrived. But this wasn't the final act. It was the opening move. If Carney's cold defiance reshaped diplomacy at the G7, wait until NATO. There, silence won't be an option. Budgets become battlegrounds. Words give way to commitments. And if Trump demands 5% defense spending again, the next summit might not end in silence. It might end in rupture. This is a warning shot, not a conclusion. The world is watching. And what happens next could redraw the lines of alliance altogether. If you found this breakdown valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Carney's move set a new standard for resisting US pressure, or are we watching the G7 crumble in real time?